Patti Davis, the daughter of Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan, who has had an illustrious career for her own as a writer. Earlier on, I think she tried her hand at acting, but she's mostly known as a writer. She also was known as being a member of the Reagan family who was not always in sync politically with the positions of her dad as he was president and in the aftermath in the years since. But she and her family are very, very part and parcel of American history. And her latest book, I highly recommend to you. It's called Dear Mom and Dad, a letter about family memory in the America we once knew. It's a fast read. It's an involving read. It's a beautiful read. Patti Davis, welcome to the Lisa Wexler Show. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. I want to tell you something.
Sure.
I briefly met your parents, and I want to tell you how I met them and what an impression they made on me, because I think you'll get a kick out of this. Your book is full of wonderful anecdotes.
Okay.
So I worked at TWA. And I worked in the Eero Saarinen building, and I was a customer service agent. And it was the summer of 1978. And I remember this very distinctly. And your father came up to my counter because he and your mother were going on a flight. They didn't have any Secret Service. This was after he had tried to get the Republican nomination, and he had not gotten it. So he was in his in-between, right? He was in between.
It was the in-between years. I remember them well.
Right. And you wrote about them. And
I did.
You did. And he came up to my desk, and I'll never forget this because I knew who he was. His face was so tan and leathery. I had never seen a face like this. It looked like the saddles that he was on all the time.
Funny.
And I remember that. And then your mother, who was not with him at the counter, like she was a few steps away from him, and then he got the tickets and he walked away. And then your mother turned to me and she gave me the most beaming smile. I have to tell you, I thought I was struck in a pool of sunlight. She was so beautiful in person. She was so beautiful. And she had this gorgeous smile. And the two of them, and again, they were surrounded by nobody at that point. There was no entourage. And I remember that moment crystal clear in time, meeting your parents. Crystal clear.
Oh.
I do.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they were very friendly, by the way. They were warm.
Yeah.
And they were warm and they were friendly. So anyway, Patti Davis, so your book I read the whole book. I just want you to know. I read the whole book, cover to cover.
Thank you.
I did. I read the whole book. And I wanted to know from you, since you are a writer for many years, what did you say in this book that you have never told anyone before, even though you have written a prior autobiography?
Well, I mean, that prior autobiography from many, many years ago, don't anybody go out and buy that. Let's not even say the title. The book we shall not mention. I mean, I wish that I hadn't written that. And, this was a different thing because for anybody who is going through a journey with their family, who's had a challenging, difficult family relationship, it really is a journey, and it's sort of about peeling away layers, and to get to any kind of peace of mind and any kind of acceptance, you have to get down to that bottom layer of things. And that bottom layer means looking at your family, looking at everything through different eyes, through a wider lens. I think when I wrote the book we shall not mention, I was in that mindset, and I've heard other people say this as well, of like, I have to tell my truth. Well, but the fact is, your truth is not the whole truth. Other people have their truths too, and they're part of the story also. And I think when you, as I said, peel away those layers, you get to a point where you are capable of looking through a wider lens, considering everybody else's truth. It's not that bad things didn't happen. It's not that you're in denial about things, or a phrase that I love that Marianne Williamson uses, pouring pink paint over the past. You're not doing that, but you're looking at things differently. So I was able at this point in my life, after working on this, to look at what each of my parents brought to the task of parenting, to look at the fact of my father being the child of an alcoholic, which, by the way, I think if you want to understand Ronald Reagan, you have to understand that everything about him bounces off the fact that he was the child of an alcoholic. That's kind of what I've come to.
And why do you say that, Patti? Why?
Because it's such a fundamental part of his of the foundation of his life. You know, you learn as a child. I don't know if you've ever read anything about children of alcoholics. I have, because trying to understand my father. You know, there are certain things that happen in that reality. My father had an incredible ability to sort of compartmentalize things, to look at what he wanted to look at and not look at what he didn't want to look at. And that's how a child of an alcoholic survives, you know?
Yeah. And the other thing about your dad, which I didn't know, that he saved 77 people. I mean, that's remarkable. Most lifeguards.
Well, I'm surprised he didn't tell you that at the TWA counter, because he was so proud of it.
I mean,
I'm shocked.
But you know, Patti, that's a lot of people to save for a lifeguard.
That's a lot of people. No, he was very, very proud of it. I'm surprised he didn't go, "Hi, can I have my plane ticket? You know that I saved 77 people."
Wow. But he did. He definitely saw himself as a hero. He did.
He saw himself. I don't know if he would have ever said hero. He saw himself as the lifeguard. He really did. The story I told in this book when I was a little girl, you know, there were 6 years there when there was just the three of us before my brother was born. So the story I told about our first house and after Christmas, when he put the Christmas wreath in the fireplace and almost lit the house on fire. And he's up on the ladder on the roof, like hosing down the roof. I mean, looking at it now, I'm going, well, yeah, he was the lifeguard. Yeah. You know, he was saving the house.
He was saving. And he didn't, you said you're not even sure he called the fire department. My mouth fell open.
I don't remember. I think, because my memory of that night is really clear. I would remember if the fire department came. And I don't think they did.
It's incredible. I'll tell you what I love the most, Patti Davis. I love the stories that come from, what does NPR say? Childhood is the longest, shortest time. I love that you remember with such resonance how he taught you to ride the waves and ride a horse ride a horse. It's beautiful, really.
Yeah, you know, the thing about childhood, and I'm not alone in this, I'm sure, is that, you know, some memories are just crystal clear. I mean, you're just back there, you know. It's like you see every detail. Others, you know, maybe you're a little fuzzy, and then some others, if somebody presents it to you, you're going, I don't remember that one at all. But, you know, some are just really, really clear. And, you know, climbing up the hill in back of our house to fly kites with my father, I can picture that so clearly, every detail of it.
What I wasn't so clear on in the book, we're chatting with Patti Davis, is when the emotional distance between you and your father crept into your life. Like, how did that happen?
Well, you know what? I'm not entirely clear about it either. And part of this story, and I think part of anybody's story who's trying to make sense of their family, has to be that there are you have to accept that there are some things you're not going to be able to explain. You're not going to be able to understand. I mean, if I to hazard a guess here, I think that as tensions between me and my mother rose, my father was always going to side with her. You know, in that sense, I sort of didn't have a chance, right?
Yeah.
He was always he was never going to sort of, you know, mediate, or, I mean, he did try to mediate sometimes. I shouldn't say that, but his allegiance with, you know, my parents were, I've described this as two halves of a circle, and everybody else orbited outside of it. So if you had tension with her, then you had distance from him. You didn't necessarily have tension, but I didn't necessarily have tension between me and my father, but it increased the distance.
We're talking with Patti Davis. I thought it was quite a bit heartbreaking the way you spoke about your mother's mother and how she groped you and pinched your breasts outside the eyes of anybody, and how you were convinced that your mother would never have believed you. Was there any time in your relationship, even after your dad passed, where you might have been able to have that conversation with her where she might have been able to? Never.
I never would. I have never told anybody about that. Not my husband when I was married, not boyfriends, not therapists. I've never talked about that until now. And the reason I want to be clear, the reason that I wrote about it now was to point out that this was the reason I didn't go to my grandmother's funeral. And looking at it now, again, through a wider lens, if I were then the person that I am now, I would have gone. And I should have gone. And that was the point that was the point of telling that story, because I think that that's how you move past wounds like that. You show up, you be the bigger person.
Yeah. It was interesting because I was reading the reason why you thought you should attend the funeral. And I thought I was going to read a different reason, Patti.
Really?
I thought you were going to say, because I just should have shown up because it would have made my mother happy.
Oh,
you see?
Well, it would have.
Right?
Yeah.
I thought out of respect to your mother that maybe that's how you reconsider. But actually, your answer was a really interesting answer, that it would have helped your growth, that it would have been for you. Yeah.
Yes. And attendant to that also, it definitely would have. I mean, she never forgave me for that, even though I apologized, probably a couple of times. I never told her the reason. I totally lied at the time. I said I was going to be out of the country on business. Real bad. I had something to do in Japan or something, doing
Patti.
a commercial in Japan or something. I completely lied.
Yeah.
But I think it is an important point to if you show up, it's like you are sort of breaking the chains of that event, whatever it was, that pattern and that wound, sort of, you're breaking the chains of it. It still happened, it still had the effect that it had on you, but you are moving past it because you're showing up.
I was thinking a lot about your grandmother. Her first name was Edith, right? I was thinking a lot about her. First of all, it's very interesting that in your mother's telling of her life story, she specifically chooses not to blame her mother too much for abandoning her for 6 years. But honestly, I mean, really, Patti. I mean, come on. And not abandoning her because she had to, let's say, migrate, like the great migration of the black women in the South who had to, make a living and then send the money down to support. She abandoned your mother in order to pursue an acting career, for goodness sakes. I mean, seriously.
Yeah, well, part of the story that I've heard, this part I do think it's true, that for a while she took my mother on the road with her. And I even remember a detail of my mother was they made dresser drawers into little, baby beds and some, cradles and stuff with blankets and everything. But, as I said in this book, being a traveling stage actress in those years was hardly glamorous.
Right.
I mean, it was a hard way to make a living. And, but yeah, I mean, 3 years old to dump her with relatives who I think she had never met before. I didn't write that because I have this vague memory that someone told me that, maybe my mother, that she'd never met them before. But it's not really solid memory, so I didn't write that. But whether she met them before or not, she didn't know them that well. She was 3 years old. How could she remember them or know them that well? And she's left with these people for 6 years.
Yeah.
And so I look now at the way my mother rewrote that history, which means she never dealt with the pain of that. She never dealt with the sort of devastation of that, or a child watching her mother leave. And she would pop in and visit sometimes, but then she'd leave again, and didn't come back until she was 9 years old, and came back and said, well, I met this doctor on a cruise, which I don't know how she got on a cruise as a traveling stage actress. Somehow she was on a cruise. And by the way, my grandfather, Ronald Davis, was married at the time that she met him. So I have no idea how all that evolved.
Interesting.
But yeah, he was married when she first met him. So she came back and said, well, I met this doctor. We're going to get married, and now you're coming with me, and we're going to live in Chicago. I mean, this is a lot of upheaval for a young child. I mean, 9 years old is you're just on the edge of puberty, and it's a really vulnerable age.
It is.
And I didn't, again, getting back to the looking through a wider lens thing, I didn't think about that before. I didn't think about really dwell on things like that in years past, because I was sort of too caught up in my own, my own situation, what happened to me. And that's what I mean about, you work on this stuff and you peel away the layers and you go, okay, let me look at what other people's stories were.
Yeah.
Right? Let me look at the other elements of this family, of this situation.
And we're chatting with Patti Davis. And, of course, Nancy Davis, she went on to try and become the actress that her mother didn't have success in. But your mom wasn't bad. I mean, she made some movies. She had a name for herself. She did okay. Yeah. She was very beautiful and charming. Yeah. You do intimate that she was so intelligent that there's no way she could have accidentally gotten pregnant. With the other shoe to drop, which is that in classic 1950s form, you sort of drop a pretty big hint, Patti Davis, that your mom trapped your father into marrying her. Well,
I think it is, from what my mother has told me about her wanting my father to marry her. I remember her saying to me once that while they were dating, that my father said to her, oh, you shouldn't be renting your house. You should buy a house. And she was so crestfallen because she didn't want to buy her own house. She wanted to buy a house with him. She wanted to marry him. So she did tell me, a couple of things like that. And I just, knowing how set she was in getting what she wanted, I mean, I obviously you can get pregnant accidentally. Or carelessly or whatever. I just tend to doubt it, And I think I wrote about this, but I'm sorry that one conversation rather that I had with her about her getting pregnant with me in the 50s, by the way, when Ingrid Bergman was kicked out of the country.
I remember that. Yes.
For being pregnant out of wedlock.
Mm-hmm. Roberto Rossellini. I know.
Yes.
I know.
And of course he was still married, but still, I mean, it was for a woman to be pregnant out of wedlock in those years was like, talk about scarlet A on you. I mean, this was just a horrible.
Patti Davis, do you remember Loretta Young, her story? Do you remember that she gave?
No.
Oh, okay, Loretta Young got pregnant by Clark Gable. And she was a devout.
I know this.
Oh, listen to this. She was a devout Catholic. So what she did was, instead of admit to the world that she had this out of wedlock baby, she went through the ruse of adopting her own baby and telling her own baby through her entire baby's growing up life that she was not her mother. No, this is a true story. And it was only because the child grew up to so resemble Clark Gable, complete with the ears, that the child was told, because she grew up in Hollywood, that she was really Clark Gable's, but she could not speak to her mother about it. Her mother refused to acknowledge that her own child was her birth child because of the shame of giving birth to her under those circumstances. Could you imagine?
Yeah. I never knew that story.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So when that one conversation that I had with my mother about, what, I can't remember exactly what my question was, something about, well, what if Dad hadn't said, let's get married? There was no DNA testing then. He could have said, it's not mine,
Ouch.
There was no way to prove that.
Yeah.
And what if Dad had not said, well, let's get, then, will you marry me? And she said, without missing a beat, she said, I knew he wouldn't do that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, that's my mother was, I wrote in here, if she had other careers, she could have been a CIA operative, or she could have, run a small country like
Patti
Ava
Davis.
Peron.
Yeah. Yeah.
She had just had this instinct for people and what they would do and how to sort of get in there and it's not that they do. I mean, listen, they were deeply in love, but how the marriage happened is what didn't just come out of, oh my God, I love you so much, let's get married. It came out of, honey, I'm pregnant.
Mm-hmm. But yet they did have a deep, enduring love. They did.
Absolutely, they did. There's
really
no
did.
question about that. Absolutely.
We're chatting with Patti Davis. Patti, I would